I am much more interested in testing decision-making than I am in testing memorization.
Distraction makers.
All right, so we messed up.
I've just been so torn up. I just can't. I'm beside myself.
We told you that the paradox of skill was something that it wasn't.
I'm so sorry.
And in fact, the paradox of skill already existed, and it's this thing that we're going to tell you about now. So from now on, the original paradox of skill that we presented is called the paradox of skill testing, and this is the real paradox of skill. It's the first errata we've had to make on the game design channel.
Errata-ing terms.
Yeah. Honestly, though, both of these are paradoxes of skill, so we're going to explain what this specific paradox of skill is. Going forward, if we're talking about one of the paradoxes of skill, we'll explain which one we're talking about. Forrest, why don't you explain what this particular paradox of skill is that we're talking about today?
Sure. So the paradox of skill that we're talking about is a term that's used usually in economic theory, and it's basically talking about the phenomenon that happens that as you are higher in skill level and working up the chain as a higher skill level player, I guess, in a game or agent, that randomness then actually plays a larger factor in the outcome of the winner of that game.
Right. So like the more skill that each player has, the more at parity in skill that they are, the more likely it is that any one random factor will determine the outcome of the game.
Yes, which kind of goes contrary to what a lot of people actually claim that they want in games. That's where, if you're interested in hearing our thoughts on why it's actually good to have randomness in games, you can check out our previous video on paradox of skill, but the different paradox of skill. paradox of skill testing.
Yeah. Before we continue the episode, this episode has been brought to you by
Void Monster. Void Monster is my TCG apparel and accessory company, where every single month I drop some new item, whether that's apparel or accessories related to TCGs, usually Magic the Gathering. This month, I've got the Giant Growth shirt that you've probably seen me wear on various episodes. The shirt is available until April 19th, where then all the pre-orders will end and I can start making orders go out to people. So if you're interested, feel free to go check out voidmonster.org.
Back to the video. So if you have two players that are equally skilled at chess, let's say both players are playing perfectly in chess. They're robots, whatever. But at the beginning of the game, you flipped a coin to see who would go first. And we know that whoever goes first, they end up winning a larger percentage of the time. It's something like, 55, 60%. If it's different than that, I'll put it on the screen. Something around that amount.
But if they're playing perfectly in a perfect world, right, just dream with us, white would win every time.
As we talked about in the previous Paradox of Skill video, the part of the solution to this problem, and the reason why you want to have randomness in your game is because it's a pathway to allowing larger skill gaps to be able to play against each other. So players that are more skilled and less skilled can have meaningful games together because there is some amount of randomness that happens during the game that players have to respond to in real time. In that same way, you're also testing a different skill, right? So if there is no randomness in the game, the skill that is mostly being tested is memorization. So you could think of it almost as like a performance at that point. There's a rehearsal, you have memorized the most optimal patterns, and then you are just playing those out as a game goes on.
For players that maybe it's hard to wrap your brains around this because we were using chess as an example. If you simplify chess down to tic-tac-toe, tic-tac-toe is sort of a solved game, or we've called it like an exhausted game, that it's basically very easy for you to go through that performance, and either if you start, you're going to tie. I think if...
It's always a catch game.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You can effectively, if both players know what they're supposed to be doing, they know the most powerful heuristic in tic-tac-toe, that will always result in a cat's game. Right. So the reason why chess it's harder to see this in chess is because the possibility space in chess is so much more vast.
Right. It's when math ends up obfuscating like probability and outcomes.
Complexity is just sort of obfuscating that it is memorization patterns. Right. So if you actually have pieces of randomness within your game, the skill that you're actually testing is decision making. It's that you are constantly and in a way this is also complexity, right? Because there's so many different variables that it becomes impossible to memorize. I guess at that point we can kind of look at magic, right? Like magic is a game that is quite good at moving that skill testing to this decision making under unknown information circumstances. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have hidden information, but you also have randomness from the deck. So there's variables at play that you don't know, but you have clues as to what they might be. We're talking previously about like, okay, if you only have a very small amount of randomness and it's mostly about skill, at what point does the scale tip in the favor of you have enough randomness that skill still matters? It's not the only thing that matters. The randomness matters too, but it's not a single point of randomness that determines the game anymore.
Yeah, and we were discussing this a little bit before recording, and I think what we kind of landed on is that you basically need to have some opportunity for you to be able to play suboptimally. And usually that's hidden information, partial information, anything like that can allow a player to sort of bluff or fake out their opponent and turn the corner. This can happen in games with completely known information, but it's actually just a player flubbing and not having that memorized play pattern and seeing that. This is why you can see a lot of chess players end up like going crazy because they feel like they should have seen this play pattern, but they just completely missed it.
Because they could have
figured it out. Yeah. Right. But in Magic, you can potentially fake an opponent out and say, well, I actually don't have this spell. No, I do have this spell. And like, suddenly turn the corner and now they were at an advantage, but now you are now at an advantage.
And it sort of creates those opportunities for playing your opponent almost more than you're playing the game, right? This is poker, this is Magic. These games that have enough hidden information that you can bluff.
A good example that I was kind of reading on when learning about the paradox of skill was talking about baseball players, actually. So you get your average like junior high team going against MLB major league players, and obviously the major league players are going to wipe the floor with them, right? The skill is so high, but what you end up seeing is that when you all have these players that are sort of an equal level of skill, either it's the variance that happens, and that can be variance of having to cooperate as a team and be very like fine-tuned in that way, or it's the random occurrences. So that can be anything from weather. It can be because it's a very physical game, suddenly you slip slightly, or you're just off just a bit, right? Yeah. And that little bit of randomness can just completely cascade and change the whole tide of the outcome of a game.
Kind of a butterfly effect almost.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that particular situation though is oftentimes it's perceived as still a component of skill, right? Like, I was running and I, twisted my ankle or something, right? But like, is that random?
It doesn't make you not good at running, right? It's like,
right.
It's like you're still really good at running. It just so happened 99% of the time when you run, you don't trip. But suddenly you trip.
But this time you did.
It's easier to think of it as like variance of cooperation with players. And so when you see team sports, right, because of the variance of the amount of players that you have, the chances of there being something that sort of goes wrong or something that maybe goes extra right for the opposite team is much higher.
Yeah, interesting thought. So, baseball is a pitcher, catcher, and then a batter, right? So like the number of players that are involved in that scenario is pretty low, right? There's only like 3 people involved. So it is really a skill test between the pitcher and the batter, right? But if those people are of equal skill, then these random factors can weigh in more. But when we look at something like football, American football, we have a lot more players on the field where there's a lot more instances for randomness to occur, which means any one random event might not be enough to really sway that play or the game, right? But you are still creating openings for lines of play for the quarterback or whatever to look at. The running back, who breaks free from what who's open as a receiver, those kinds of things. I think this is something that makes it such a popular sport for people to watch, is that it is substantially more exciting when you can see those openings occur and then a player able to take advantage of those openings. And I think Magic's very similar, right? There's enough randomness there that there's surprise, right? There's situations that you as a player, lines of play that emerge because of the overlapping systems of randomness, that the skill is identifying those rather than memorizing all possible options and performing the game. You are now playing the game. The skill is, how do I make good decisions? How do I see lines of play through the variance to victory?
Most of the time when you end up looking at these sort of theories from an academic standpoint, they usually stem from wanting some sort of real world application, right? So trying to understand something that is politically driven or economically driven so that you can play that game much more efficiently. And we talk about how we believe games are more of a reflection of real world experiences, right? And so I think what it does is having randomness be introduced in this way is just bringing players closer to those real world experiences. So tying something like Magic closer to something like baseball or football is because we don't have the opportunity to run into either these forms of variance or these random outcomes, right? So you need to build the opportunity for players to be able to experience that in a simulated form, abstracted by this card game.
I brought up earlier the tipping point, right? Where how do we know that there's enough randomness or not? And I think we're going to touch on a concept here that we're going to make another video about at some point called the Kelly criterion, which is effectively a strategy for playing through randomness, right? It's that if you're effectively, it's if you're behind, you should play more risky. If you're ahead, you should play more conservatively.
In its like simplest form.
In its simplest form. I'm
It's the game Yahtzee.
Generalizing. Right. It's the Yahtzee is a good example of this, where if there isn't enough variables of randomness, you can operate based on this principle, and you will have effectively the best chance of winning, which means that it's a sort of a very powerful zero-level heuristic in those types of games. So you want to make sure that there's enough variables at play that isn't just the only way to play the game. Right. That it's difficult to know whether you're ahead or behind. There's ways to trick your opponent to thinking that you're either behind or ahead, right? These you can play those mind games in that way. Hidden information is a big part of this, but it is also layers of randomness that make it so that you can't necessarily know exactly who's ahead or not.
Recently, someone in our Discord linked a video, and it was talking about maybe we should link it in the description, but it was a video kind of talking about how Napoleon can be credited for basically the development of war games. And it's a very long...
Almost modern hobby games.
Modern hobby games, yes. Basically, to sort of jump forward a little bit in that timeline, a lot of discussion of the game Kriegspiel. Kriegspiel is sort of the quintessential war game that was popularized and then abstracted into what we know as Warhammer and D&D and stuff now. But at the time, the big innovation of Kriegspiel that was very debated at that time was actually introducing randomness. So anytime that it'd output randomness to a Warhammer unit, if you're familiar with that. So essentially, as a unit is going to attack another unit, you'd actually roll a die, and there'd be some sort of a more complex calculation as to how much damage it would do and what the results were. But that was introduced with Kriegspiel, and it was done as a way of trying to realistically account for all of the variance and randomness that happens in the real world.
Well, and I'm not sure if this is how Kriegspiel was always played, but Kriegspiel has a game master, right? Yeah. Where and effectively you'll move your units, give your orders to your units, and you'll give your orders to the game master, and both players will do that, and then the game master sort of behind the scenes will crunch the numbers. Having this level of variance it's almost more on the simulation side of games rather than the abstract side, right? Where you're trying to simulate the fact that you could have the best strategy, but it doesn't always work, right? Yeah. So the real skill to be tested is not how well you've memorized a book on strategy. It's how do you actually respond in the real world scenario.
Yeah, it's really honing in on adapting given suboptimal circumstances, right? If you are going second in chess, you're put in a suboptimal position, so how are you then able to take advantage of that position?
So the other thing to talk about here is where the randomness is placed and how much that matters, right? So the easiest example here is the coin flip in chess happens before the game starts. So if you are in the sort of inferior position, you're in the suboptimal position starting the game out, you have the entirety of the game to try to make up for that sort of bad luck. Yeah. But if instead we moved the coin flip to the end of the game, suddenly it's just the coin flip is all that matters, right? And this is abstract because you can't really do that in chess. You need somebody to play first. But you could see this as what Richard Garfield refers to as rando chess, which is we play a game of chess, and then at the end we roll a d6, and if it comes up 6, the person who lost the chess game actually wins. So skill still matters in that instance, but that one determining factor of randomness, the perception would be that decided the game, right? So players wouldn't have any opportunity to make up for that. So in some ways, we can look at this as input and output randomness, but it really depends on like at what point in the game that randomness occurs.
It's tough. We kind of abstracted this and thought a bit about like, okay, well, what if you were to look at Magic in that way? And if instead you had a 60 card deck of Magic, but there was only 5 different cards, that you could have, and just tons of copies of it that you randomly drew. Or if you could always have access to the same 5 cards, but there's a 50-50 chance that it succeeds or fails.
Right. So like our example was lightning bolt, right? So you're going to try to attempt to draw a lightning bolt from your deck. Let's just make it easy and say the deck only has 6 cards in it and lightning bolt is one of those cards. Right. Versus if you played lightning bolt and you rolled a d6, and if you roll a 6, that lightning bolt succeeds or fails. But you can always choose lightning bolt, right? So in the instance of I'm drawing a random card, you're now being forced to use a suboptimal card if you didn't draw lightning bolt, but that could still potentially win you the game. Where in the case where you play the lightning bolt and it just fails, you can always make the most optimal decision, but the randomness is what is determining whether or not it actually works.
Right. And I think what we found is that what ends up happening is that it's not that you don't still have to react to suboptimal play in the output version of this, where you could always play the lightning bolt and it might fail. But what ends up happening is that you're basically it's the concept of who's the beat down from Magic, or like you said, either you're ahead and at an advantage, or you're trying to be riskier and get and make up for your lack of an advantage. So basically there's only 2 lines of play there. You know whether you're ahead and to keep going, or if you're behind and you need to be willing to risk a little bit more in order to move forward.
And you can always choose what of that you're going to do.
Right.
So it comes down to the Kelly criterion.
When all the information is known in that way, it's just a test of memorization.
The other instance here with the output randomness part of this is that as long as the output randomness happens before like the final turn of the game or the final act of the game, you can effectively view the output randomness as input randomness for the next turn, right? Whereas if it's input randomness before you act, that will not ever feel like it's necessarily determined. I shouldn't say it never, but like it's less likely that is felt as being deterministic, right? Where if I have a lightning bolt and I can always use a lightning bolt and my opponent's at 3 health and I play the lightning bolt and it doesn't work, right? I roll a d6 to see if it works and it doesn't. That feels substantially different than if I draw a card, it happens to not be a lightning bolt, but I still can try to play. I still have an option to do something else.
So there's definitely implications for like design choices with the randomness, but I think, it's really beyond that. It's just like what ends up being more or less skill testing. And I think that there's technically more of a memorization skill test if you go with the output direction, but more of having to improvise, right? And having the opportunity to sort of turn the corner and strategize with suboptimal play if it's input.
There's also another factor here, which is that if you zoom out far enough, output randomness is also still input randomness. And what I mean by that is if you're playing multiple games, right, you're like, okay, well, this game happened to end this way. But in my totality of my gaming career, when I look at my ELO rating, I can see that randomness happened to be deterministic in that game, but it's not deterministic across a wide spectrum of games. It's really just adding noise to the data collection of who is better at the game.
Something that we kind of talk about when we talk about games acting as a simulation of real world experiences, and sort of an exercise of that. I think that one kind of good way of being able to determine like if something is really emulating an experience is if you can connect it back to like an abstracted real world experience. And I think that what this is pointing out is that when you have randomness introduced in these types of games, that's actually connecting even closer to a simulated experience of a real world event,
right?
Or a challenge.
There's always factors outside of your control,
right?
Yeah.
But I think that intrinsically, for some reason, a lot of people that play games want to feel like they have all of that control,
or that their sort of skill is all that matters. And,
right.
For me, game design wise, the takeaway is similar. Like this is part of my thesis of design is that I am much more interested in testing decision making than I am in testing memorization. So my goal is to create, abstracted experiences of reality that tell particular stories and that almost always involve some amount of randomness. And how you make decisions under different kinds of random pressure, right? Okay, in this, if these are the forces put upon you, how do you act? If these are the forces put upon you instead, how do you act in that scenario? And I think that it vastly helps in storytelling as well. It creates a much wider palette, I guess, to tell a story with. You're creating a system of a particular feeling that then can be experienced in a multitude of different ways because of the overlapping systems of randomness.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about the real paradox of skill and not that faker, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below. Also, if you're interested in discussing this and the previous paradox of skill, you can join our Discord. You can find a link to that in the description down below.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
I don't know shit about baseball.
It's true.
Yeah.
Me neither.
Whoops.
It's a good example, though.
I know. I'm glad I brought it up.